Nearly 6 decades ago, a young woman in Cedar Rapids walked out of a bar on a late winter night and never made it home. In just a few hours, the quiet life of an entire community was torn apart, with the only trace of her being the shadow of a green Cadillac vanishing into the freezing darkness. No cry for help, no signs of a struggle, no eyewitness who saw it happen, just an eerie silence that fell over the neighborhood. Police later found the Cadillac abandoned deep in the woods, but there was no reasonable explanation for how it got there. Scattered clues, strange shoe prints, papers bearing a fake name, and a story about a man calling himself Alan Grove only made the case more mysterious. Years passed, suspects appeared and vanished like ghosts, while Marian Turner's family continued to live in grief and unanswered questions. No one could understand why an ordinary woman would become the target of a shadowy figure drifting across multiple states. And then, just as the file was about to be buried under the dust of time, one tiny detail that seemed meaningless was suddenly discovered, beginning to drag the entire case back into the light. From faint fingerprints, soil samples in the trunk, to a familiar alias in federal records, everything started coming together in ways no one saw coming. Yet the story behind this disappearance turned out to be far more chilling than anything the people of Iowa ever imagined. Before we dive deep into this spine-chilling journey, let us know where you're watching from, and if you think cold cases like this matter, don't forget to hit subscribe so you don't miss any part of it. That night, Cedar Rapids was wrapped in damp air, and the yellow glow of streetlights spilling across the silent pavement, creating the familiar stillness of a Midwestern residential neighborhood. Marian Turner left the Maple Leaf Lounge around midnight, stepping out of the bar's neon lights alongside a stranger who introduced himself as Alan Grove, the man driving a standout green Cadillac in the darkness. A few lingering patrons outside saw them leave almost simultaneously, the car heading in the direction of the townhouse complex where Marian lived, with nothing appearing unusual except that the Cadillac sped up faster than normal as soon as it melted into the quiet night. The townhouse complex where Marian lived was always peaceful at night, with only a few dim lights still on in some windows. Yet around the time Marian should have arrived home, several neighbors heard strange noises coming from the parking lot and the walkway between the units. One described the sound of a car door slamming hard, followed by hurried footsteps. Another recalled hearing something like a heavy object hitting a hard surface, but when they peeked through the curtains, they saw no one in the darkness outside, except the blurred shape of a vehicle pulling away from the complex. No one thought to report it because at the time everyone assumed it was just the usual noise of late-night arrivals. The next morning, when Marian didn't show up at Collins Radio on time as she had for years, a few co-workers initially thought she was sick or had a sudden family emergency. But by mid-morning, when they couldn't reach her at home or at the office, worry started to grow. Colleagues called her townhouse but got no answer. Once the family was notified, they rushed over. The door was still locked, the curtains undisturbed, and there was no sign Marian had returned after leaving the bar. The phone inside went unanswered. All her personal belongings were exactly where she'd left them. After searching the area with no trace whatsoever, the family called the police to report that Marian Turner was missing. When Marian Turner's family called to report her missing, the desk officer at the Cedar Rapids Police Department was the first to take the information. The call came in the afternoon, while the station was still busy with routine business. The officer heard the anxious voice of a relative explaining that she had been out of contact since the previous night, hadn't gone to work, left no message, and couldn't be found at her townhouse. After noting the basic details and assessing the initial circumstances, the officer quickly forwarded the case to detectives to begin the first step, determining the last time Marian was known to have been seen. The clearest starting point was the Maple Leaf Lounge, where the family confirmed she had been the night before. A team of investigators went to the bar that same afternoon, while the manager and the bartender from the previous shift were still on duty. The Maple Leaf Lounge was a popular late-night spot, so reconstructing Marian's presence required cross-checking statements from multiple people. The bartender said Marian left quite late. Though she wasn't a regular who stood out, that particular night she stayed longer than usual. Staff clearly remembered her standing up, grabbing her purse, and walking out the door with a man she had been talking to for part of the evening. The man introduced himself as Alan Grove, but no one at the bar recognized him as a regular. When pressed for more details, the bartender described him as a white man, middle-aged, dark hair, neatly dressed in a dark coat, and clean shoes, the look of someone reserved but confident. Several patrons sitting near the bar also confirmed seeing Marian and the stranger. They said the two showed no conflict or odd behavior. One patron described how both stood up at roughly the same time and left just a few steps apart. Though no one overheard their conversation, nothing about the scene raised alarm at the time. When investigators expanded to the parking lot and exit area, they gathered additional statements. A man waiting for a friend in his car remembered seeing a dark green Cadillac start up and pull out of the lot right after the pair walked out the door. The Cadillac headed toward the route that led to Marian's residential area. That statement matched the family's initial belief that Marian intended to go straight home after leaving the bar. Besides the Cadillac, another witness mentioned seeing a brown sedan parked across from the Maple Leaf. The car had been sitting there for a while, lights off, with no indication it was waiting for someone or about to leave. When police followed up, the witness said the sedan was there around the same time Marian and the stranger left, but couldn't say whether it was connected or just coincidence. Since there was no evidence yet of a direct link, the brown sedan was noted as background information, not yet significant enough to prioritize, but still kept on file. When all the statements from inside and outside the Maple Leaf Lounge were compiled, detectives had their first clear picture of the night Marian disappeared. She left late, either with or right behind the stranger calling himself Alan Grove. The Cadillac's direction matched the route she normally took home. Up to that point, no one witnessed any coercion or conflict at the bar. The only noteworthy elements were that the stranger was unknown to regulars, and the presence of the brown sedan during the same window. Still, the last moment anyone could definitively place Marian remained the front door of the Maple Leaf Lounge. From the second she stepped outside until the family realized she never came home, that entire stretch of time became a giant blank in the timeline. The investigation team's conclusion for this phase was recorded clearly. Marian Turner was last seen leaving the Maple Leaf Lounge, with no witness confirming she ever reached or approached her townhouse complex. That became the critical foundation for every subsequent step. After establishing Marian Turner's last confirmed sighting at the Maple Leaf Lounge, the next standard investigative step was to determine whether her disappearance could have been voluntary. This is mandatory protocol in every missing person case, but from the very beginning, the circumstances surrounding Marian already leaned heavily away from that possibility. At her townhouse, police noted that nearly all of her personal belongings were exactly where they should be. The only thing missing was her purse, which made sense if she never made it home from the bar, not because she was preparing for a long trip. Closed documents, everyday jewelry, bills and work papers were all untouched from the morning before. No luggage had been pulled out, nothing appeared missing, and there were no signs she had packed anything at all. Everyone close to Marian described her as stable, disciplined, never impulsive, and never prone to sudden decisions. Her job at Collins Radio had been the cornerstone of her life for years. She was considered highly responsible, and almost never missed work without notice. Showing up late or absent without calling was unprecedented. Police also checked her most recent financial records. There were no unusual withdrawals, no signs she was preparing for major spending, and no bank activity of any kind after she left the bar that night. Her home phone showed no outgoing or incoming calls throughout the night or the following morning. A complete communication blackout was completely out of character for Marian, who kept a very regular routine. Detectives explored other possibilities. Could she have decided to stay at a friend's house? Could something urgent have come up that prevented her from contacting anyone? But every theory was quickly dismissed by the facts. No note, no contact with friends, no sudden appointments, and zero evidence she planned to leave Cedar Rapids even briefly. People closest to her added more context about her life: an independent woman with clear daily habits, no debt, no personal troubles, and absolutely no history of running away, even during stressful periods. Disappearing in total silence, without warning, without taking essentials, and without any preparation, was the complete opposite of her personality and lifestyle. Investigators also considered the chance she suffered a sudden medical emergency on the way home, but that was unlikely. There were no reports of accidents or injured persons in the area that night. Moreover, accounts from the bar showed she didn't leave appearing tired or unwell, and the man with her showed no urgency that would suggest rushing her to a hospital or handling a crisis. When everything was weighed together, her stable lifestyle, work habits, financial review, and the total absence of any departure preparations, the odds of Marian voluntarily walking away from her life were virtually zero. Instead, every piece of passive evidence pointed in only one direction: Marian encountered outside interference sometime after leaving the Maple Leaf Lounge, and before she could reach her townhouse. On that basis, Cedar Rapids Police officially reclassified the case from a standard missing person investigation to one involving suspected criminal activity, focusing intensely on the window immediately after she left the bar, the last known thread leading to her disappearance. When the police fully completed their assessment of the possibilities of voluntary departure and fully shifted to the direction of suspecting external intervention, the next step in the investigative process was a thorough forensic examination of Marian Turner's townhouse. This was the only location that could potentially contain traces of whether Marian had returned home or at least approached the property before disappearing. The investigative team arrived at the townhouse in the afternoon of the same day the missing person report was filed, when the sunlight had begun to soften, but the neighborhood remained fairly quiet. The small two-story house sat at the end of the row. Both the front and back doors were locked from the outside, with no signs of prying or forced entry. This reinforced the suspicion that if Marian had returned, she was the one who locked the doors, or she had never crossed the threshold on the night she vanished. Upon entering, the first thing that caught the investigators' attention was the living room. The space showed a few signs of disturbance: an armchair rotated out of its usual position, a stack of magazines lying on the floor, and the area rug bearing light creases as if someone had walked across it in a hurry. However, the degree of disorder was too minor to conclusively indicate a struggle had taken place. There was no broken furniture, no drag marks on the carpet, or the kind of scattered objects typically seen in a physical altercation. The investigators documented the scene with both possibilities in mind: either Marian had returned home and had some minor interaction before disappearing, or these traces were entirely random, from her normal daily activities the previous evening. There was no basis to be certain either way. Examining the house's most vulnerable points, door frames, locks, gaps, windows, and the rear balcony area, the police found no evidence of forced entry. No pry marks, bent metal, or scratches on the lock surfaces sufficient to indicate someone had attempted to break in. This added further complexity to the case. If Marian had returned, her disappearance was not the result of a stranger breaking in from outside. Meanwhile, if she had never entered, the question became even larger: where had she vanished in the very short distance between her car and the front door? One critical factor that continued to steer investigators toward the hypothesis that Marian never entered the house was the absence of her purse. In missing person cases, a purse is often high-value evidence because it contains keys, personal documents, and sometimes the last items the victim was carrying. Inside Marian's townhouse, the purse was not in any of its usual places. She had a habit of placing it on the table near the door whenever she came home, but the tabletop was clean, showing no indication the purse had been there the previous night. This matched the statements from the Maple Leaf Lounge, where Marian was last seen carrying the purse when she left. The entire ground floor, including the small kitchen that opened into the living room, showed no blood, scuff marks, or any evidence related to injury. There were no objects that appeared to have been used as weapons, no discarded clothing, no unfamiliar shoe prints on the hardwood floor. The second floor yielded similar results. The bed was neatly made, the vanity undisturbed with all items in place, windows securely closed. What the team encountered was a scene that was too clean to the point of raising suspicion that if Marian had actually entered the house, any attack on her would had to have been extremely sophisticated or left absolutely no trace. The investigative team spent most of their time examining the front entrance area, walkway, and parking lot. The small yard in front of the townhouse was very close to the neighborhood sidewalk. It took only a few minutes to reach the front door from the parking area. There, the team noted several points of interest: a small patch of soil disturbed next to the walkway, but not enough to conclude a heavy object had been dragged or someone had fallen. A faint smudge on the concrete, whose cause could not be determined, and most notably, the complete absence of any clear footwear impressions, possibly due to the hard surface or dry weather causing prints to fade quickly. The possibility that Marian had come within a few steps of her front door was entirely plausible based on the parking spot location and the neighbor's report of hearing noises. However, there was also no direct evidence proving she had unlocked and entered the house. The intact locked door, the lack of sufficient interior disturbance to suggest a struggle, and the missing purse all pushed the conclusion in one direction. Marian did not enter the house, or if she did, whatever happened occurred too quickly and left no clear traces. Upon completing the search, the police issued a cautious assessment. The townhouse provided no definitive evidence that Marian had entered after leaving the bar, but the surrounding environment indicated she had likely come very close to her front door. The short space between the parking area and the threshold became a critical blank zone in the case, an unsolved shadow and the most suspicious location for possible external intervention. After completing the townhouse search and finding no clear evidence that Marian had entered, Cedar Rapids police expanded the investigation to the surrounding area, focusing on the route connecting Maple Leaf Lounge to Townsend Court, where Marian lived. It was a relatively short drive, with few complicated intersections, and generally well lit at night by streetlights. Nevertheless, despite the identifiable route, no one could confirm exactly which path Marian took after leaving the bar. This forced police to canvass every small segment for supporting statements. Investigators went door to door along the streets Marian was likely to have traveled. Some residents were still awake at the time she left the bar, but most did not clearly remember seeing anything the previous night. Still, a few scattered statements began to form a faint but valuable picture. An elderly woman living on a street near Marian's recounted seeing a woman walking toward Townsend Court late at night. She couldn't see the face clearly because of dim lighting, but the woman's build, gait, and dark clothing reminded her of Marian when police later showed identification photos. However, she could not be 100% certain, having only glimpsed her for a few seconds while checking her own front door. A man living in an apartment adjacent to the townhouse parking area said he saw the silhouette of a vehicle turning into the complex roadway around the same time frame. He wasn't sure it was the green Cadillac mentioned at the Maple Leaf Lounge, but his description of round headlights, vehicle height, and engine sound led police to note the possibility it was the same car that had driven Marian. This statement helped strengthen the clue that Marian may have been driven back to her neighborhood that night, though it remained unclear whether she actually got out of the vehicle. Another piece of evidence came from a taxi driver working the night shift. He reported seeing a dark-colored Cadillac heading toward Townsend Court around the estimated time Marian left the bar. The driver did not see any passengers inside or note the license plate, but the location and direction matched the possibility that Marian was en route home. However, not all statements aligned perfectly. Another man living a few blocks from Townsend Court said he saw a woman walking quickly past the street behind the townhouse row late at night, but his description of height and hairstyle did not fully match Marian's. This prevented police from concluding whether it was her or simply another resident out late. Additionally, a young witness living near Townsend Court stated she heard a car engine and a car door closing, but when she looked out the window she only saw the taillights of a vehicle driving away and no one getting out. This both supported the idea that Marian had come close to the complex and simultaneously raised the possibility she never actually walked toward her townhouse door. When cross-referencing all statements, police noted significant noise in the timeline. The interval between Marian leaving the Maple Leaf Lounge and neighbors hearing sounds near the townhouse was less than an hour, yet each witness provided a different puzzle piece. Some saw a lone woman walking, others saw a vehicle entering the complex, and some only heard sounds without seeing anyone. Investigators had to consider the likelihood that multiple witnesses were off on timing. In a quiet residential area, any nighttime activity is easily remembered, but not always accurately timed. A discrepancy of a few minutes or even tens of minutes could make the timeline difficult to connect. Nevertheless, when all statements from the route up to the area near the townhouse were compiled, investigators still reached one important conclusion. Marian most likely came very close to her residence that night, though it could not be confirmed whether she actually exited the vehicle or approached the entrance. The distance between the parking space and Marian's townhouse door was extremely short, less than 1 minute on foot. This made everything that might have happened in that narrow space the focus of analysis. But due to the absence of physical traces inside and around the house, police could only rely on the fragmented and sometimes inconsistent witness accounts. Despite the vague and occasionally contradictory timeline, the majority of the data still pointed to the same conclusion. Marian had approached her home before vanishing, and her journey after leaving the Maple Leaf Lounge appeared to have stayed on course toward home. This was a crucial finding for determining the area where she was most likely subjected to interference. While investigators were still trying to piece together the scattered statements around Townsend Court, new information reached the Cedar Rapids Police Department the following morning, opening an entirely different investigative direction. A resident living near the wooded area of Squaw Creek Park reported seeing a dark-colored Cadillac near the park entrance at dawn, matching the time frame when Marian was believed to have disappeared. Initially, the report was treated as data requiring verification and was not immediately prioritized, since the forest was a considerable distance from Marian's home. However, the color and model matching the Cadillac seen with the unknown man at the Maple Leaf Lounge meant police could not ignore it. Investigators contacted the reporting resident for details. The man said he happened to wake up early and noticed a dark green Cadillac parked on the shoulder near the forest entrance, headlights off, but movement of figures around it caught his attention. Because that area is deserted at that hour, the presence of a large luxury vehicle like a Cadillac stood out as unusual. He could not see the license plate or identify who was inside, but he was certain it was the only vehicle he saw there that night. Upon receiving the report, police immediately cross-checked it with prior information, the Cadillac seen leaving the Maple Leaf Lounge heading toward Townsend Court. However, the route from Townsend Court to Squaw Creek Park was not a normal path, prompting the team to question why the vehicle would appear in a remote wooded area at an hour inconsistent with ordinary activity. This suggested the Cadillac may not have remained in Marian's neighborhood or left it very shortly after the noises neighbors heard. The investigative team decided to examine the described location. Upon arrival, Squaw Creek Park retained its usual tranquil appearance, with the forest entrance shaded by trees and dry dirt trails extending deep inside. No Cadillac was present, but the soil along the roadside showed large tire tracks wide enough to match an older model Cadillac. Although the exact time the tracks were made could not be confirmed, it was sufficient for the team to begin treating the forest as a potentially relevant area in the disappearance. Police conducted a preliminary sweep around the entrance, bushes pressed down in several spots, lightly broken branches, and faint foot impressions on the ground not clear enough to determine direction, but all indicating human activity within hours of the report. These traces were not strongly confirmatory, but they added credibility to the residents' account. To leave no possibility unchecked, the team decided to expand the search deeper into the woods. While most of Squaw Creek Park is vast and difficult to cover quickly, the area near the entrance remained the priority to verify the Cadillac had stopped there. Investigators surveyed trails, small slopes, streamside areas, and patches of ground that might show vehicle or foot impact. Although no items directly linked to Marian were found, the atmosphere at the scene showed signs different from other locations. Vegetation compressed along lesser-used paths. When police compared this information with the still unexplained portion of the timeline, one possibility became clearer. The Cadillac left the bar carrying Marian, traveled toward Townsend Court as witnesses described, but then left the neighborhood and appeared at Squaw Creek Park very shortly after the sounds neighbors reported. This made the scenario that Marian was moved away from Townsend Court and taken to the forest worthy of serious consideration. Squaw Creek Park, with its large forest and maze of trails, is an ideal place to conceal or abandon items. This was why police treated the Cadillac report as a major lead that could open an entirely new investigative avenue, rather than focusing solely on Marian's residence. Even without specific physical evidence yet, the Cadillac's appearance in the wooded area carried enough weight for police to add Squaw Creek Park to the list of locations requiring thorough search. Investigators discussed organizing a larger-scale search with assistance from Forest Patrol units and local search teams, because any lead pointing to the woods at this stage was invaluable. The conclusion of this investigative phase noted, the report of the Cadillac at Squaw Creek Park was the first link between Marian Turner and the forest, marking a significant shift in focus from the Townsend Court residential area to a completely new search direction. This was a pivotal development in the case, laying the groundwork for discoveries that would soon follow. After the tip about a green Cadillac seen near Squaw Creek Park was confirmed as worth investigating, Cedar Rapids police immediately expanded the search deeper into the woods. The appearance of the vehicle in such a remote area at the exact time Marian vanished forced the investigation team to treat the location as the one most likely to hold the critical answers in the case since it began. A search team was deployed the next morning, consisting of police officers, park rangers, and local support units. It didn't take long for the team to locate the green Cadillac in the forest, several hundred yards off the main road. The car had been positioned between two large trees, its front end covered with leaves and dry branches, as if someone had deliberately tried to make it harder to spot from a distance. Despite being abandoned and silent, the vehicle showed no signs of forced entry or theft, and the body had no major collision damage. The lights were completely off, the front doors were closed but unlocked, and none of the windows were broken. The parking spot was deep enough into the woods to raise immediate suspicion about its purpose. No ordinary driver would stop there at night. When officers ran the plates, they confirmed they belonged to a legitimately registered vehicle in-state. But when investigators cross-checked the records, they discovered the registered owner was a person who did not exist. The address was an empty house, and the name yielded no records in any population database. This was clear evidence that the Cadillac had been operated under a false identity, reinforcing the suspicion that the man last seen with Marian had been concealing who he was from the very beginning. As investigators continued to work the area around the car, one member of the search team spotted something unusual about 150 feet from the vehicle along a little-used trail. At first it was just a dark piece of fabric beneath the leaf litter, but when they got closer they realized it was part of a woman's clothing. The area was immediately sealed off. Within moments the team confirmed the grim sight, the body of a woman lying among the decayed leaves, in early decomposition but still recognizable enough for a preliminary identification. Initial comparison of clothing and physical build led police to confirm that the body was that of Marian Turner. The discovery instantly changed the entire nature of the case. What had been a missing person investigation with no clear explanation officially became a homicide. The on-scene examination revealed that Marian had been shot once in the back of the head. Based on the bullet trajectory and wound characteristics, detectives concluded the weapon was most likely a .38 caliber handgun, a common type that was extremely difficult to trace because of its widespread civilian and law enforcement circulation. This indicated an execution-style killing, carried out at close range with clear intent. In addition to the fatal wound, Marian's wrists showed circular bruising and abrasion marks typical of having been bound with rope or tape before the body was left. This confirmed that the victim had been restrained and unable to defend herself or escape when she was brought to the woods. The ground around the scene provided more critical information. Footprints were present in multiple locations, with different patterns and sizes. Some were large, consistent with an adult male, while others were smaller, or had completely different sole tread patterns. This raised the possibility that at least one other person besides the primary killer had been near the body, though it was unclear whether that presence occurred before or after Marian was murdered. Natural disturbance of the scene made it impossible to determine the exact sequence or timing of the prints, complicating the question of who exactly had been at the scene. The entire area around the body was cordoned off and meticulously documented. However, the soil conditions at Squaw Creek Park, dry on the surface but soft underneath, caused some prints to distort and prevented direct comparison. Even so, the existence of multiple sets of footprints showed that more than one person had moved through the area, which did not fit the theory of a lone killer who left the scene clean. Finding Marian's body and the Cadillac at the same time created a major turning point in the investigation. Cedar Rapids police immediately upgraded the case from missing person to homicide, activating full protocols for a detailed autopsy and forensic analysis of everything recovered in the woods. From that moment, all efforts focused on identifying the killer, tracing the true origin of the Cadillac, and most importantly, figuring out why Marian had been taken to such a remote location far from her home. The discovery of the body not only answered the question of what had happened to Marian Turner, it also opened a flood of new questions that would shape the entire direction of the investigation going forward. The discovery of Marian Turner's body and the abandoned Cadillac in Squaw Creek Park marked a crucial turning point in the investigation, but it also quickly exposed the severe limitations of 1960s forensic technology. Although police recovered numerous pieces of evidence, most of it could not be effectively used at the time, and the case stalled just a few months later. The biggest unsolvable problem: DNA did not yet exist in criminal investigations. Even though the scene and the body likely contained cells, hair or biological traces, in 1966 there was no technology or database to analyze them. Samples could only be sealed and preserved, essentially useless for the initial investigation. Police lifted several partial fingerprints inside the Cadillac and near the body, but they were smudged and lacked enough ridge detail for manual comparison. Nationwide computerized fingerprint databases did not exist, and most fingerprint records at the time were local only. When compared by eye to known criminal files, nothing matched. The prints never rose to the level of prosecutable evidence. The Cadillac's origin was another dead end. The plates were valid, but the registered owner turned out to be a fake identity tied to a vacant address. No witness had ever seen the car in the area where it was supposedly registered, and there was no trail to the actual user. The fact that it had been operated under a non-existent identity showed the killer had planned the cover-up from the start, leaving investigators with almost nothing to follow. Meanwhile, the .38 caliber handgun that delivered the fatal wound left no trail back to its owner. It was an extremely common firearm, used widely by civilians and law enforcement alike, so caliber alone could not lead anywhere. No gunshots had been reported that night, and no matching weapon was ever recovered from the car or the surrounding woods. The multiple footwear impressions at the scene, different sizes and tread patterns, created more confusion than clarity. Shoe print analysis technology was virtually non-existent, There were no comparison databases, and the forest soil had distorted many of the prints. Although the tracks proved multiple people had been present, police could not establish when each print was made, or whether they were directly connected to the killer. Another lead that initially seemed promising, the brown sedan seen near the Maple Leaf Lounge, fizzled out. Witness descriptions were too vague, there was no license plate, and no distinctive features. Despite canvassing the bar's regular customers, no one knew whose car it was. The lead was eventually dismissed as unverifiable. Every piece of evidence appeared to point somewhere, but none pointed clearly enough to a specific suspect. There were no traffic cameras, no advanced forensic microanalysis, no national databases for cross-state matching. Every clue stopped at suspicion, nothing connected into a coherent chain. Over the following years, Marian's file was reviewed multiple times by different detectives, each hoping to spot something overlooked. But no new witnesses came forward, no additional physical evidence surfaced, and no viable suspect emerged. The lack of usable data forced police to accept that the case had outstripped the tools available at the time. By the late 1970s, after years of no progress, Marian Turner's file was shelved and officially classified as a cold case. Every detail, the Cadillac, the fake name Alan Grove, the mysterious footprints in the woods, was left hanging, like broken threads that could not be tied to any central knot. The case faded into silence, leaving a gaping hole in the collective memory of Cedar Rapids for decades. When Marian Turner's file was closed in the late 1970s, the case slipped into obscurity. Yet in neighboring states and even farther afield, a new series of crimes began attracting law enforcement attention. From Minnesota to Nevada, Arizona, and Idaho, departments reported a middle-aged male subject linked to thefts, fraud, and especially a string of small but sophisticated bank robberies. What stood out was not the crimes themselves, but the way the perpetrator constantly changed identities. Throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, FBI agents documented a long list of aliases tied to these crimes. Alan Groves, Alex Greer, Andrew Gale, Grant Rowe, and many similar variations. Each alias came with reasonably complete fake paperwork, ID cards, temporary addresses, sometimes even fabricated employment histories. Though each name was used only briefly before disappearing, they all shared one obvious pattern: simple short surnames, usually starting with A or G, easy to remember, spell, and say without drawing attention. This pattern led federal investigators to suspect that one highly skilled individual was behind the string of identities, a person exceptionally good at hiding his background and exploiting the limitations of the era's manual identification systems. This was a time before unified national databases, when moving between states with forged documents was relatively feasible for someone who knew the system. What caught agents' attention even more was the subject's consistent behavior. Always calm and in control, frequently visited bars, social venues, or hotels shortly before committing a crime. Never left clear fingerprints, always vanished before authorities could close the net. Composite sketches compiled over the years showed a white male, average build, middle-aged, dark hair, all matching the description of the man known as Alan Grove, who was last seen with Marian the night she disappeared. But at that time, no one in Iowa knew about this multi-state alias pattern. Cross-state connections existed only as scattered notes in separate FBI field offices. A major break came in the early 1980s, when a Nevada bank robbery forced the suspect to abandon some documents he hadn't had time to destroy. Among them was a fake ID in the name Greg Gale. When FBI technicians examined faint erased lettering beneath the ink, they recovered fragments that appeared to belong to a real name. Combining this with data from other investigations led to a stunning conclusion. Military records revealed that a man named Gregory Randall Baker had served in a unit with technical intelligence components. He had been trained in document handling, identification forgery, and trace concealment techniques, skills that perfectly matched the criminal pattern observed across multiple states. After leaving the military, Baker had drifted across northern and western states, never staying long in one place. Each appearance brought a new alias, a quick crime, and disappearance before local authorities could catch up. This constant movement spread his record thin across jurisdictions, preventing any single agency from building a complete picture. FBI files also noted that in several cases Baker frequented bars or social spots immediately before a crime, a pattern strikingly similar to how Marian met Alan Grove at the Maple Leaf Lounge. When agents compared the name Alan Grove to aliases like Alan Groves, Andrew Gale, and Alex Greer, the structural similarity was unmistakable, simple names built on a consistent interchangeable template. Yet even as these parallels began appearing in FBI notes, no system existed to automatically link an old Iowa murder to a multi-state criminal using aliases. Marian Turner remained just one forgotten victim file in Cedar Rapids storage, not flagged in any federal database. The FBI's observations about Baker's aliases were stored as isolated fragments, waiting for future technology to connect the dots. Still, a picture was slowly emerging. For roughly 15 years after Marian Turner's murder, a man with extraordinary skill at concealing his identity had operated across state lines under dozens of different names. And when forensic technology finally advanced in the late 20th century, all those scattered pieces would eventually converge, bringing the name Gregory Randall Baker back into the center of the Marian Turner file, as a prime suspect who had evaded Iowa detectives for more than 2 decades. When the true identity of the man behind multiple aliases was confirmed as Gregory Randall Baker, tracing his military past became a critical step in understanding how one individual could maintain dozens of identities, move across state lines, and avoid leaving a trail for years. Military records quickly revealed that Baker had served in military intelligence, a unit responsible for training soldiers in information gathering, surveillance, document identification, creating cover identities, and using false papers in field conditions. Though he had no distinguished record, Baker underwent enough training to build the foundation for the skills he employed during more than a decade of crime under various names. According to the files, Baker participated in assignments that required rapid movement between bases, making him accustomed to leaving no consistent schedule. After leaving the service, this habit became an advantage. He constantly changed residences, never stayed in one city too long, and used fake documents to create a new layer of cover whenever he appeared in a new state. This also explains why, in numerous crime reports, the suspect always carried different names, but had a similar physical appearance. When the FBI reviewed a series of thefts, frauds, and bank robberies throughout the 1970s and 1980s, they noted a common pattern. The perpetrator often approached women who were alone in bars or social settings before disappearing with a new alias. He had the ability to quickly build initial trust, spoke naturally, dressed neatly, and knew how to make victims feel safe. These details aligned significantly with the circumstances in which Marian Turner met the man calling himself Alan Grove at the Maple Leaf Lounge, an important similarity, but not yet enough to serve as evidence. Numerous witnesses in other states described Baker as always acting with calculation, never leaving clear fingerprints. At many crime scenes, police only recovered smudged or partial prints that were insufficient for analysis with the technology of that era. This was exactly the same characteristic as the evidence collected from the Cadillac in the Marian case, where only partial fingerprints were found and could not be manually matched. Baker also habitually used vehicles registered under false names or rented with forged documents. In many reports, he appeared with vehicles that were not tied to his real identity. This directly matched the green Cadillac found in the Iowa woods, valid plates, but the registered owner did not exist. That was the typical preparation of someone experienced in creating false identities. Regarding his operational pattern, Baker typically committed crimes or scams in one location, then quickly left before local authorities could narrow the suspect pool. Every state that recorded his presence described short stays and no indication that he ever had a fixed residence. This explains why, despite appearing in numerous reports, no single police department had enough information to realize he was the same person. The most striking coincidence with the Marian Turner case lies in the fact that Baker often chose social settings, approached victims when they were alone, and created a sense of safety before leaving with them to another location. This pattern was identical to how Alan Grove approached Marian on the night she disappeared. His calm demeanor, ordinary appearance, and confidence meant that those around them never saw him as a threat, allowing him to move with the victim without drawing attention. Nevertheless, at the time Baker's aliases surfaced, no forensic evidence was strong enough to link him to the Marian Turner case. DNA technology did not exist. Smudged fingerprints could not be manually compared. There was no national footwear or ballistics database. Thus, despite numerous similarities in the approach to women, use of false identities, and movement patterns, everything remained at the level of suspicion. In the eyes of federal authorities at the time, Gregory Randall Baker was simply an interstate criminal with exceptional disguise skills. But for the Marian Turner file, he had not yet become an official suspect. The lack of forensic evidence, lack of direct proof, and lack of information sharing between states meant this lead could not make its way back to Iowa in the 1970s and 1980s. Only decades later, when forensic science had advanced dramatically, did all these similarities finally have a chance to be re-examined, and Baker's name would ultimately become the crucial piece connecting what Cedar Rapids could not solve in 1966. Entering the early 2000s, as forensic technology had completely transformed how cases were solved in the United States, the state of Iowa launched a program to review decades-old unsolved cases. Among hundreds of files examined, the Marian Turner case, the woman who disappeared and was later found murdered at Squaw Creek Park in 1966, stood out as one that could clearly benefit from modern forensics. The limitations of that era had caused the investigation to stall, but now old evidence and exhibits could be re-examined with entirely new tools. All physical evidence stored since 1966 was removed from sealed storage. Bags containing hair samples, fabric samples, forest soil, partial fingerprints, shoe print photos, and the Cadillac's registration documents were re-examined from scratch. The cold case team, made up of veteran investigators and young forensic experts, began digitizing every item of evidence. The goal was clear: turn samples that seemed useless in 1966 into data analyzable with modern technology. The first evidence prioritized was the smudged fingerprints once found inside the Cadillac. Using AFIS, the National Automated Fingerprint Identification System, the team rescanned the prints, despite knowing the odds of a match were low. But the mere ability to compare millions of records in seconds offered hope that the 1966 investigators never had. Next were the hair samples recovered near Marian's body. Previously, they were only listed as supplementary evidence, but in the 2000s, they became a critical key thanks to DNA testing. The state lab received the samples to test whether DNA could be extracted, a step that had been impossible before. The cold case team also reanalyzed Marian's likely route using modern mapping. They reconstructed the most logical path between the Maple Leaf Lounge and Townsend Court, marking locations where the Cadillac might have turned, stopped, or avoided populated areas. Sections of road overlooked in the original investigation were now seriously considered, because they could fit the pattern of a perpetrator trying to hide traces. The 1966 witness statements were systematically reviewed again. Instead of discarding statements that didn't match perfectly, the cold case team organized them by relative time blocks, recognizing that many witnesses could easily be off by a few minutes, completely normal in dark conditions. These statements helped build a more flexible timeline in which Marian could have reached near Townsend Court before being moved to Squaw Creek Park. The green Cadillac, the biggest dead end of the 1966 investigation, was also analyzed with new technology. The team queried federal databases to see if other vehicle registrations used similar fake names or invalid paperwork patterns. What Iowa police once couldn't do was now standard, cross-referencing federal data, comparing numerous records of similar behavior, and checking whether the Cadillac in Marian's case fit into a larger pattern. When cross-referencing the list of aliases the FBI had recorded over the previous 3 decades, the cold case team noticed that the structure of the name Alan Grove, the man last seen with Marian, was identical to many of Gregory Randall Baker's aliases. This was a detail that had never been connected, because Iowa previously had no access to federal data. Now for the first time, Alan Grove was treated as a plausible variation within the chain of false identities Baker used in other states. The team also re-examined crime scene documentation from Squaw Creek Park. Shoe prints were analyzed with modern simulation software to assess size, direction of movement, and depth, allowing estimates of the perpetrator's weight and behavior. Data that seemed disconnected in 1966 could now be linked across both space and time. Photos of the body, the Cadillac's location, and the overall scene layout were reconstructed in 3D models. Thanks to this, the cold case team determined that the perpetrator could have left the car, dragged Marian down the trail, committed the crime, and returned to the vehicle in a short time. This fit perfectly with the rapid movement pattern Baker typically displayed when committing crimes across states. Once the entire file was digitized, cross-referenced, and analyzed, the cold case team recorded the first breakthrough finding. The Marian Turner case was no longer confined to the context of 1966. With new forensics, federal connections, and the ability to track identities across states, they realized Marian may not have been the victim of a random stranger, but of a perpetrator with a clear operational pattern, a man who used aliases to approach women in social settings. But only when the forensic results came back to the investigators did they learn that their suspicions were not only correct, they were the beginning of the biggest turning point in the entire case. When the Iowa Cold Case Unit applied modern forensics to the 1966 evidence, the first results that came back quickly changed the entire direction of the case. Samples once considered useless in the 1960s now became the key to directly linking the crime to an interstate suspect, Gregory Randall Baker. The most important breakthrough came from the partial fingerprint recovered inside the Cadillac door. In 1966, the print was too smudged for manual comparison, but once digitized and run through AFIS, the system returned a list of potential matches. The standout result was Gregory Randall Baker, based on matching characteristics in the ridge whorls. Experts then performed a manual comparison and confirmed the partial print showed significant similarity to Baker's military record fingerprints. This was the first time in nearly 4 decades that crime scene evidence linked to a real individual. At the same time, analysis of the soil in the Cadillac's trunk yielded another breakthrough. The 1966 soil sample was retested using modern mineral and microbial analysis. The results showed a high match with soil from the location where Marian's body was found in Squaw Creek Park. This strengthened the conclusion: the Cadillac had not just been in the woods, it had directly transported Marian's body. Another piece of evidence once downplayed, the shoe prints, was now processed with modern simulation software. After analyzing depth, soil compression, and tread pattern, experts concluded that one of the prints at the scene was consistent with military-issue boots given to military intelligence personnel in the 1960s. This was not enough to identify the perpetrator, but it was a notable coincidence when viewed alongside Baker's military background. Then came the most surprising moment: the DNA results from the hair found near Marian's body. When the lab successfully extracted a DNA profile, they confirmed the hair did not belong to Marian. This proved that at least one other person, besides the killer, had been present at the scene, or during the body's transport. Although the DNA did not match anything in CODIS at the time of testing, it opened an important possibility. The killer had an accomplice, or someone arrived after the body was dumped. While forensics provided physical clues, one detail once considered minor in the 1966 file suddenly became significant: the name Alan Grove. When the cold case unit compared it to the FBI's recorded aliases from the 1970s, 80s, they saw Baker's naming pattern matched almost perfectly. First names often started with A or G, short, easy-to-pronounce last names, familiar two-syllable structure. Many of Baker's aliases, such as Alan Groves, Andrew Gale, Alex Greer, followed this template. Alan Grove was therefore no longer a random name, but a logical variation in the chain of false identities Baker used throughout his criminal career. When the forensic and behavioral data were compiled, the cold case unit built a picture connecting the scattered pieces. Partial fingerprint in the Cadillac matched Baker via AFIS. Soil in the trunk matched the area where Marian's body was found. Shoe print consistent with boots issued to military intelligence, the unit Baker served in. Foreign DNA from hair, evidence of a third party at the scene. Alias Alan Grove fit Baker's fake name pattern, with 5 different types of evidence from fingerprints, soil, footwear, DNA, to alias behavior, all pointing to a single suspect. The Marian Turner case entered a new phase. Investigators realized that what had stalled the case wasn't a lack of clues, but a lack of technology to unlock them. Now, with 21st-century forensics, everything began to fit together like pieces of a larger picture. Marian Turner was highly likely the victim of a perpetrator with a clear pattern of approaching lone women, a man who once served in military intelligence and then lived a decades-long interstate criminal life under dozens of false identities. But the investigation could not rely on forensics alone. To reach a conclusion, the Iowa Cold Case Unit needed to thoroughly analyze Baker's entire criminal history, to see whether crimes in other states had any direct link to Marian's death. And that step would reveal the most important discoveries in the entire case. When modern forensic results were synthesized, fingerprints matching Baker, soil samples in the Cadillac trunk matching the location where Marian's body was found, shoe prints matching those issued to military intelligence, and the alias Alan Grove matching Baker's pattern of fake names, the Iowa Cold Case Unit began reconstructing the entire journey Marian went through on the night she disappeared. Unlike in 1966, this reconstruction relied almost entirely on forensics, recreating a logical and consistent chain of events. The clearest starting point was when Marian left the Maple Leaf Lounge with the man calling himself Alan Grove. Although there were no cameras or recordings in 1966, multiple witness statements matched about her leaving the bar with the green Cadillac. The partial fingerprints in the car, matching Gregory Randall Baker's records, confirmed that Marian had indeed been in that Cadillac, not just a coincidence or mistake. This was the last time Marian was seen alive. From the bar to Townsend Court was only a few minutes' drive. Modern investigation combined with old statements showed the Cadillac heading in the right direction toward Marian's neighborhood. Some witnesses claimed to have seen someone resembling her walking near the townhouse late at night, and although the reliability of the statements was once questioned, remapping showed this was entirely feasible. However, Marian's townhouse showed no signs she had entered, no purse, no changes in order, no signs of struggle, nothing indicating she had been home. This allowed the conclusion that Marian may have gotten near Townsend Court, but was intercepted before stepping inside the house. The next route was confirmed thanks to the soil sample in the Cadillac trunk. Modern analysis concluded that the soil in the trunk highly matched the soil at Squaw Creek Park, where Marian's body was discovered. This proved the Cadillac was not just abandoned randomly, but was used to transport Marian to the murder location. From Townsend Court to Squaw Creek Park took only a short time, and the new forensic estimate of the time of death window, about 30 to 60 minutes after Marian left her neighborhood, fit perfectly with this journey. The body showed Marian was bound before death and shot with a .38 in the back of the head, a close-range execution style, prepared and showing complete control of the situation. There were no factors fitting with Marian leaving Iowa voluntarily or falling into a random conflict. All traces showed she was taken to the woods in a defenseless state. The Cadillac was then abandoned deep in the woods, in a position hard to see from the walking path. Notably, there were no tire tracks leaving the scene, indicating the car was not used to depart. This was an important feature in Baker's behavioral pattern in other states. He often abandoned the crime vehicle and left the scene by a second means, self-driven or picked up. DNA results from hair not belonging to Marian showed the presence of at least one other person at some stage of the incident. Although whether the third person was an accomplice or someone who appeared after the body was left remained undetermined, this detail reinforced the possibility the perpetrator moved by more than one vehicle. When the pieces were put together, the timeline emerged clearly. Marian left the Maple Leaf Lounge with Alan Grove, got near Townsend Court but did not enter the house, was subdued and taken to Squaw Creek Park, was bound and murdered with a .38. The body was dragged into the trail, the Cadillac was abandoned, the perpetrator left the scene by another means. The entire chain of events fit perfectly with Gregory Randall Baker's modus operandi, someone capable of moving quickly, using false identities, not leaving clear fingerprints, knowing how to choose remote locations, and having a habit of abandoning vehicles used in crimes. More importantly, modern forensics proved that Marian did not leave Iowa voluntarily and did not encounter an unexpected incident. She was deliberately led, from the bar to home, then to the woods, in a consistent and organized chain of actions. When the forensic timeline was completed, it not only placed Baker in the top suspect position, but also opened the next important question: was Baker in Iowa on the exact night Marian disappeared? That would be the focus of the next investigation part. When the forensic timeline was reconstructed seamlessly, and most links matched Gregory Randall Baker's modus operandi, the Iowa Cold Case Unit moved to the key analysis step, comparing all of Baker's aliases, handwriting, behavioral style, and identifying features to determine if he had the capability, precedent, and conditions to be the last man with Marian Turner. This part aimed to answer a central question: was Alan Grove actually one of Baker's false identities? The investigation team started by analyzing the structure of fake names Baker used over many decades. Federal records showed he consistently used aliases with a consistent motif, first names starting with A or G, Alan, Alex, Andrew, Greg, short, neutral, and easy to pronounce last names, Gale, Greer, Rowe, Groves. This pattern was not just aesthetic, but also helped Baker remember and improvise quickly in situations requiring oral identity declaration. In particular, the FBI noted that Baker often swapped the first-last name structure in some aliases, for example Andrew Gale, Alex Greer, Alan Groves, Greg Rowe. The Cold Case Unit compared this pattern chain with the name Alan Grove, the name witnesses at the Maple Leaf Lounge heard on the night Marian disappeared. This name not only matched in syllables, but also lay right in the center of the pattern Baker used over 2 decades. This led the investigation team to conclude that Alan Grove was an alias completely fitting Baker's system of fake names, not a random coincidence. Next, the investigation team compared handwriting samples from Baker's signatures, collected from military records, fake job applications in some states, and bank papers left in an unsuccessful robbery with the handwriting on fake papers recovered from the Cadillac case in Iowa in 1966. Although the Cadillac registration was only a blurry photocopy of a fake identity, the handwritten part adding serial numbers and identifying symbols was clearer. Handwriting experts identified many similarities: letter slant, downstroke on G, connection between letters, and especially the habit of capitalizing the first letter in a slightly right-leaning style, a feature Baker was noted for in aliases in Nevada and Arizona. Next, the cold case unit evaluated victim approach behavior. According to FBI records and crime reports in 3 states, Baker tended to appear in bars late at night, approach women alone, build trust with a polite appearance and confident attitude, leave the bar right after successful approach, take the victim to a secluded or private location before acting. This behavioral chain matched what happened to Marian, approached at the bar, left with a strange man, and then taken to Squaw Creek Park Woods, a secluded location outside a logical travel direction. Additionally, Baker was famous for his ability to evade traces, not leaving clear fingerprints, matching the partial prints in the Cadillac, using cars registered under fake identities, abandoning crime vehicles, moving across states right after committing crimes. All these features completely matched how the perpetrator acted in Marian's case. The Cadillac was registered under a fake name, abandoned in the woods, with no traces of withdrawal using that car. All were patterns Baker applied in later crimes. The cold case unit also reviewed Baker's military record. Documents showed he was trained in military intelligence, a unit providing observation skills, distraction, fake paperwork creation, and leaving scenes without traces. More importantly, shoes issued to this unit matched the shoe prints found at the scene. Although not enough to identify, this coincidence was a strong plus in the suspect comparison mechanism. When putting all factors together, fitting fake name, similar handwriting, identical approach behavior, matching movement pattern, military shoes matching scene shoe prints, the investigation team reached a solid conclusion that Baker not only fit the description of the last man with Marian Turner, but was also the only one over 4 decades, with records, skills, patterns, and conditions matching every layer of clues in the case. And when federal documents were reviewed, the cold case unit discovered a final detail, reinforcing the suspicion. Baker had appeared in a town less than 60 miles from Cedar Rapids, in the exact week Marian disappeared, under another alias. This not only put him in feasible range, but placed him right at the center of the investigation. Baker was no longer a potential suspect. He had become the #1 suspect in Marian Turner's death, awaiting confirmation by subsequent findings. When aliases, behavior, and forensic traces all converged on Gregory Randall Baker, the Iowa Cold Case Unit continued with an important analysis step, comparing the .38 bullet recovered from Marian Turner's body with other cases Baker was suspected of involvement in. This was the final part to determine if Baker only matched in pattern or truly had a technical link to Marian's murder. In 1966, the bullet's rifling was only manually recorded, unable to compare with national records. But when modern ballistics comparison systems emerged, the bullet was digitized and entered into the federal database. An unexpected result appeared. The twist and groove rifling of the bullet shot into Marian highly matched the bullet in a violent attack case in Minnesota in 1974. The Minnesota case was not a murder, but the victim, a woman living alone, was shot while trying to escape the attacker. The bullet was recovered and analyzed years later, becoming one of the first samples entered into the national system. The Minnesota record had an important detail. The perpetrator rented a car with fake papers and called himself Alex G., an alias later confirmed to be in Baker's chain of fake identities. The rifling groove match between the bullets in Iowa and Minnesota showed both were highly likely fired from the same .38 revolver. This was extremely important because Baker was famous for keeping some crime tools, especially guns, for use over many years, a pattern federal records noted in his bank robberies and break-ins. When reviewing cases Baker was involved in from the 70s to 80s, the cold case unit saw many repetitions, using aliases when approaching women alone, moving across states after each incident, using small caliber guns to control victims, avoiding leaving clear fingerprints, abandoning crime tools or vehicles at scenes. These factors all appeared in Marian's case. Alias Alan Grove, Cadillac registered under fake name, incomplete partial prints in the car, and close-range execution method. Next, the cold case unit, compared with cases Baker was suspected in Colorado, Nevada, and Illinois. In them, many witnesses described him carrying a small dark gun, often hidden in a coat, matching a .38 revolver. A 1978 report in Nevada described the perpetrator declaring the fake name Alex Greer, while another in Illinois, in 1979, recorded alias Andrew Grove. These aliases not only resembled patterns Baker used, but were almost variants of the name Alan Grove. Behavioral analysis also led to an important recognition. Baker often approached women in social environments, especially bars, with a confident, polite attitude without raising suspicion. This was a method completely matching how he approached Marian at the Maple Leaf Lounge. In many cases, he took victims to low-traffic areas before using force. Squaw Creek Park, where Marian's body was found, fit completely in the pattern of location choices Baker had applied. The cold case unit also noted that in federal reports, Baker usually operated alone, but there was some evidence showing he sometimes had support from a second unidentified person. The discovery of foreign DNA on hair at Marian's scene made this possibility considered more carefully. If there was an accomplice that fit the pattern of moving by a second vehicle, suspected in the Cadillac abandoned in the woods case. When synthesizing all information, rifling, matching the Minnesota case, similar aliases, matching attack patterns, identical victim approach styles, and long-term gun use habit, the cold case unit realized that Marian Turner's case was not just an isolated incident. Instead, it fit like the first link in Baker's long chain of criminal behavior from the late 60s to the 80s. For the investigation team, this was an important turning point. Technical evidence had linked Marian's murder to another case in the national system, and the perpetrator of that case used an alias matching the structure of Alan Grove. From here, only one key question remained: was Baker in Iowa on the night Marian disappeared? The next part would answer that question. After cross-referencing ballistics, forensics, and behavioral patterns, all converging on Gregory Randall Baker, the Iowa Cold Case Unit decided to take the unavoidable next step, directly interviewing Baker at the Federal Correctional Facility, where he was already serving time for robbery and fraud convictions. The goal was not to wait for a confession, but to observe his reactions when confronted with forensic evidence he could neither anticipate nor easily dismiss. The moment Baker entered the interrogation room, his demeanor immediately matched the FBI profile: calm, guarded, eyes scanning every tiny detail in the room. He sat down with the familiar posture of someone who had been through countless interrogations, arms crossed over his chest, leaning back slightly, maintaining a faint smile, as if this conversation were merely a harmless formality. The investigator opened with questions about his use of multiple aliases. Baker shrugged as though it were too trivial to discuss. "You travel a lot, sometimes you change your name for convenience." He neither admitted nor denied it, exactly the evasive pattern he had employed for decades. When asked about the name Alan Grove, Baker tilted his head slightly and gave an unreadable smile. The fleeting expression showed he recognized the name, but he chose a vague reply. "Sounds like the kind of name someone uses when they don't want to be bothered." No confirmation, no denial, no cooperation. The same familiar coping strategy. Next, the investigator placed enlarged copies of the partial fingerprint recovered inside the Cadillac in Iowa in 1966, side by side with Baker's military fingerprint card. When asked how he explained the match, Baker replied, "A smudged print could belong to anybody." A textbook tactical response. He didn't challenge it, but he also gave them nothing to grab onto and corner him with. He showed no surprise, further convincing the team that he knew exactly what he was being compared against. When the investigator mentioned the soil in the Cadillac's trunk, Baker leaned back, eyes drifting to the wall. The soil sample was a perfect match for the ground where Marian Turner's body was found, a forensic conclusion impossible in 1966. Baker's refusal to react, rather than protest, was exactly the kind of controlled silence described in his FBI behavioral profile. Regarding the military boot print, the investigator explained that the impression at the crime scene matched the type issued to military intelligence, the very unit Baker had served in. Baker gave a soft chuckle and said, "The Army issued those boots to thousands of guys. It wasn't just me." Again, no denial and no admission. The investigator then moved to the forensic timeline, the chain of events proving Marian left the Maple Leaf Lounge with Allen Grove, went near Townsend Court, and was taken to Squaw Creek Park, and killed in under an hour. They asked Baker, "Can you prove you weren't in Iowa that night?" He answered with chilling nonchalance, "I traveled a lot. I don't remember every single day from over 30 years ago." No denial of guilt, no attempt to create an alibi, no emotional reaction. This was the exact response pattern the FBI considers typical of offenders who operated under multiple aliases. Say as little as possible, avoid misspeaking, and never show confusion. The interview lasted nearly 2 hours. Throughout, Baker stuck to his strategy, never denied any piece of evidence, offered no alternative explanations, never confirmed an alias, never challenged the forensics, and never displayed emotion when confronted with the timeline. But that very refusal to deny became extremely significant. Subjects like Baker, trained in military intelligence, rarely slip up. If the evidence were weak, he would attack, mock, or dismantle it. Here he chose silence or deflection. That told investigators the forensics had exceeded his ability to manipulate. At the end of the interview, the Iowa Cold Case Unit reached a firm conclusion. Baker could not refute the fingerprint, could not explain the soil sample, could not distance himself from the alias Allen Grove, could not dispute the military boot print, could not challenge the reconstructed forensic timeline, and could not explain why the bullet rifling matched the Minnesota case. The investigation report stated clearly, Baker does not need to confess. The forensic evidence has done it for him. With the level of convergence across multiple layers, fingerprint, ballistics, geology, military footwear, alias, behavioral pattern, and timeline, the Cold Case Unit determined the evidence had surpassed reasonable doubt. It was strong enough to recommend formal prosecution of Gregory Randall Baker for the 1966 murder of Marian Turner. At this stage, the question was no longer whether Baker was involved, but when the indictment would be issued, and how Baker would react when both his past and modern forensics all pointed directly at him. Once the Baker interview concluded, the Iowa Cold Case Unit entered the final phase of the investigation. This was the moment when all forensic, behavioral and ballistic data were compiled into an official conclusion to present to the Iowa State Prosecutor. The goal was no longer to find new leads, but to confirm whether the existing evidence was strong enough to close the Marian Turner case, after more than 4 decades. Every specialty team was brought together: fingerprint, geology, footwear, ballistics, and alias analysis reorganized their findings into a unified structure. Though each type of evidence was only one piece of the puzzle, together they formed a clear, consistent picture that could not be explained by any hypothesis other than the direct involvement of Gregory Randall Baker. Fingerprint, the starting point for identifying the perpetrator. The partial print lifted from inside the 1966 Cadillac, once thought useless, became a critical piece when digitized and run through AF. The high degree of similarity, with Baker's military prints, plus manual confirmation of matching characteristics, proved Baker had been inside the vehicle that transported Marian. There is no reasonable alternative explanation for the match. Soil match, proving the Cadillac was the body transport vehicle. Mineral and microbial analysis of the trunk soil showed a clear match with soil from Squaw Creek Park. This eliminates any possibility that the Cadillac was simply abandoned in the woods by coincidence. It had been at the exact location where the body was found, meaning the vehicle was directly involved in the murder or disposal of Marian. Shoe print, trace evidence matching Baker's military unit, the depth, weight distribution and tread pattern of the print at the scene matched boots issued to military intelligence, the exact unit Baker served in. That boot style was not common in civilian life, and certainly not common in Iowa in 1966. This created yet another layer of match perfectly consistent with Baker's military background. Alias links, a pattern of fake names that cannot be coincidence. The name Alan Grove, overheard by Marian on her final night, fits perfectly with Baker's known cross-state alias pattern, first names starting with A or G, short, easy to pronounce, two-syllable surnames. His known aliases, Alex Greer, Andrew Gale, Alan Groves, follow the same structure. There is no reason to believe Alan Grove was not simply another variant in Baker's fake identity system. Ballistics, the direct link between Iowa and Minnesota. The .38 bullet recovered from Marian's body has rifling marks, matching the bullet from the 1970 Minnesota case, where the perpetrator used the alias Alex G. and fled using a movement pattern identical to Baker's. This ballistic match is strong technical evidence, showing the same gun was used 8 years apart, consistent with Baker's habit of keeping weapons for long periods. When all evidence groups were considered together, the Iowa Cold Case Unit reached its final conclusion: Baker was present in the crime vehicle. Baker possessed the skills, prior record, and behavioral pattern matching the offense. The alias Alan Grove fits his fake identity chain. The vehicle used matches the soil where the body was found. The footwear impression matches the military boots issued to him. The .38 revolver in the Marian case matches the gun used in the Minnesota case, tied to Baker. No alternative hypothesis can explain the entire chain of facts. At the end of the compilation process, the Iowa State Forensic Laboratory signed off. The existing evidence has exceeded the threshold of reasonable elimination. Gregory Randall Baker is the only suspect who fits the complete profile of the Marian Turner case. Shortly thereafter, the Iowa Attorney General's office officially declared the Marian Turner case solved, despite the perpetrator never confessing. It was the conclusion Cedar Rapids had waited over 40 years for. The file was closed, not because leads had run out, but because every piece had finally fallen into its proper place. When the Iowa Attorney General's office announced that the Marian Turner case, pending for over 4 decades, had been solved through modern forensics, Cedar Rapids fell silent for a moment before erupting in waves of reaction. For many residents, especially those who lived in the city in the late 1960s, the news brought a mixture of relief and horror. The killer, Gregory Randall Baker, was not an ordinary criminal. He had drifted through multiple states, constantly changing identities, blending into communities as a completely normal person. The fact that someone like him was in Cedar Rapids the very night Marian disappeared made people realize that even a quiet Midwestern town was not immune to highly organized, federally level predators who knew how to cover their tracks. The community was especially shaken by the revelation that Baker had approached Marian at the Maple Leaf Lounge, using an alias, something many local women said they had feared at the time, but lacked the words to describe. Many shared stories of the mysterious stranger at bars, never imagining he was a military-trained interstate criminal. Not only Marian, but quite possibly other Iowa women in the 1960s, had unknowingly interacted with a dangerous man. The psychological impact rippled to later generations. For those who grew up with the Marian Turner story, the resolution brought closure to a dark chapter in local history. They had grown up seeing Marian as a warning that even the most cautious, upright people could fall victim to sudden violence. Now, learning the killer was not someone from the community, but a nomadic criminal, gave them a new, both tragic and more realistic, perspective on their city's past. Culturally, The Marian Turner case quickly became a textbook example cited by media and forensic training programs when discussing cold cases. Cedar Rapids residents followed the investigation for months, and when the forensic findings were made public, many experts praised it as proof of the power of modern forensics. A partial fingerprint ignored in 1966, a soil sample kept just in case, a boot print, and alias pattern, all eventually became the foundation for naming Baker as the suspect. This changed how the Iowa community viewed forensics entirely. Previously, many believed cases that old could never be solved. The Turner case proved a seemingly hopeless file could light up again with one technological advance or new database connection. For Cedar Rapids, it was a reminder that justice does not always arrive on time, but it is not always lost forever. The case also increased trust in local law enforcement. Though it took over 40 years, residents were comforted knowing evidence once considered worthless had been carefully preserved for decades, waiting for forensics to catch up. That attitude became part of the community identity, showing that even a case thought forgotten could resurface and be solved through the determination of new generations of investigators. Ultimately, the greatest lingering impact was the respect shown to Marian Turner, a name spoken for years as a symbol of unresolved pain. When the case was solved, the people of Cedar Rapids not only received the truth, they were able to close an old chapter with empathy, understanding, and renewed faith that the light of justice, however late, can still dispel darkness that lasted generations. Looking back at the story of Marian Turner and Gregory Randall Baker in today's America, many details that seem like the past actually touch on issues still burning today. Personal safety, trust in the justice system, and how communities cope with violence. Marian simply went for a few drinks at the Maple Leaf Lounge after work, an utterly normal part of American culture, yet trusting a man who introduced himself as Alan Grove, driving a shiny Cadillac, reminds us that in the age of dating apps, social media, and carefully crafted profiles, verifying the person behind the name remains critically important. Baker's aliases, from Alan Grove to variants like Alex Greer and Andrew Gale, are identical to how bad actors today use multiple accounts to build trust before exploiting it. The story also shows the importance of sharing information and reporting promptly. Neighbors hearing noises near Townsend Court, residents reporting the Cadillac at Squaw Creek Park. Those small details later allowed the Iowa Cold Case Unit to reconstruct the timeline. In modern life, if something feels off in a parking lot bar, or on the way home, speaking up to police, neighbors, or simply noting the time license plate, can become the foothold that protects yourself or someone else. At the same time, Marian's 40-plus-year journey reminds us to keep faith in the system. A partial fingerprint, a little trunk soil, a military boot print, the rifling on a .38 bullet, pieces that seemed meaningless, eventually found their voice when AFIS, DNA, soil analysis, and federal databases advanced. The real-world lesson is, live proactively, stay alert, but not paranoid, trust your instincts when something feels unsafe, and believe that reporting, preserving, and cooperating with authorities today may be the key to protecting someone or yourself, even if justice sometimes arrives very late. Thank you for joining us on this journey to close one of Iowa's coldest cases. Please subscribe to the channel to keep exploring stories brought to light by the power of modern forensics. See you in the next video, where we'll continue searching together for the truth hidden in files time seemed to have forgotten.